Hi, my name's Richard Baines and I provide training for Cinema 4D from 3dverve.com. In this tutorial I'd like to show you how to work with the Scale tool, Hierarchies and Animation. I'll be showing you different ways to change the size and scale of objects and what can go wrong if you do things the wrong way. First off, I'd like to look at hierarchies, so let's go for a new file, File New, create a cube, just click here, click and drag it down a bit on the y-axis there, create another cube. This one I'd like to be somewhat smaller, so I'll change to the Scale tool, click and drag to the left to bring it down in size, and I'll just move it up a little. I'll go back to the Move tool, click and drag up on the y-axis. So that's nicely set up. The next thing I want to do is rename the cubes here. So I'll click on the top one there to get its attributes up in the Attributes Manager. Under the Basic tab, if you don't have the Basic tab, just select it there. You can change the name, and I'll rename this Child. Just type it in. A quicker way to rename an object, I'll show you with the second cube, is just to double click on it, and you can type the new name in straight away. I'll call this one Parent. So next I want the child to be a child of the parent. What I need to do is click on the child, drag down, hover over the parent. When you see that down arrow, release there to create the hierarchy. So let's have a look at how it works now. Child selected, and you see that I can move the child around without affecting the parent. Switch to the Rotate tool. You see the child can play around as much as it likes, but as soon as we select the parent, let's go back to the Move tool, as soon as we select the parent says it's time to go, the child has to go along with it. Whatever the parent does, the child must do too. Now if you find that your hierarchy is not working like this, let's just go back to the Move tool, it could be that you have axis modification enabled. If that's selected and enabled, you'll find that when you move the parent, the child stays where it is. So for it to work correctly, just ensure that you have this disabled. So that's how the simple hierarchy works, how we create it. Now let's have a look at how it might be applied in practice. We're back with my friend the robot again. Don't expect Pixar to be calling anytime soon, but it's good enough for this demonstration. Let's have a look at the hierarchy. At the top we have the body, and everything else is a child of it. So let's go to the Move tool. When I move the body, everything else moves. Moving down we have the head, and everything else is a child of the head. So switch to the Rotate tool, and when I rotate the head, you'll see all of its children rotate with it, but the body stays where it is. Further down we have the nose, and the children of the nose are actually the eyeballs. It's a bit of an unusual setup, but I think it works quite well in this instance. So let's go to the Move tool, take a look at that, and when I move the nose, you'll see the eyes move along with it. We can move the eyeballs independently as they're children of the nose. So I'll click and drag a mark around them both. If I go for the Scale tool, click and drag on the x-axis, they're going to get smaller, but they'll also get a bit closer together. You can see the effect there. So that's how we can set up a model for animation using hierarchies. Next I want to look at how we can change the size and scale of different objects within the hierarchy and what effects that's likely to have. So I'll open another new file, and I'll create a cube. Move tool selected, and if I click and drag on the different axes, I can move the cube accordingly. If I switch to the Rotate tool, click and drag on the red axis here for X, you'll see I rotate around the X-axis, and the same with the others. I can rotate the cube as I please. But If I switch to the scale tool, things are a bit different. If I click and drag on the y-axis, for example, or the red axis, it scales in all directions. Select the cube, go for the coordinates tab here. You'll see that scale, S for scale there, is at 1. And if I resize the cube, it remains the same. So what we have here is P for position, S for scale, and R for rotation. We're not changing the scale at the moment. What we're actually changing, if I go to the Object tab, is the size. As I click and drag, you see the size changing there. If I want to change just in X, for example, I can click and drag up or down on these little triangles to change it there. I can also do this interactively. See this little orange square here? As I hover over it, it highlights. If I click and drag on that, I can change the size interactively in the viewport. There's one for each one. Can't quite see that one at the moment. There it is. If I bring it down a bit, you can see it more clearly. Okay, so just to remind you, go back to the coordinate tab. The scale has remained the same, and we've changed the size. Let's see how that affects a hierarchy. So let's create a cone. Just select the cube, scale tool, click and drag to the left away from the axis, you note. Let's just switch to the move tool and bring the cone up so we can see it more clearly. Make the cone a child of the cube. Select the cube, and as I change its size in X, you can see it doesn't affect the cone at all. If I select the cone, you'll see that it too has these little orange squares in different places where you can change it in the viewport. Okay, so back to the cube and the scale tool, and if I click and drag on the axis here of the cube, you see that I can resize them both at once, so that can be quite useful. You don't actually need to use the axes. You can click and drag anywhere in the viewport to resize them both there. The size of the parent, the change in the size of the parent being transmitted to the child. There is actually a way to change the scale of the cube, the parametric object there, and that's to change modes. It's not a good idea though. You'll see why shortly. So I'll switch from model mode to object mode, and now when I click and drag on the axis, you see the scale changing there. Let's check it out in the coordinates. I'll select the cube, coordinates tab, and there you can see the change scales. Just bring it in a bit in Z. The problem comes if I now select the cone and start to rotate it. Not too bad the first time, but if I do it again, it soon becomes quite uncontrollable. The problem is that it's passing through the scaled axis of its parent, and its own axis becomes skewed as a result, as I think you can see there. So for that reason, always stick to the model tool when you're modelling, and particularly when you're using hierarchies. The object tool does have its uses in animation, and we'll come to that shortly. For now, I'll go back to the model tool, delete the cone, go back to the cube, and I might want it to be a stable parent again in the future, so I'll take its scale back to 1 in X, Y and Z. At the moment it's a parametric object. It's got the object tab there, and I might want to give it a fillet, change the number of edges for example. There's not a lot more than that I can do with it, so what I'm going to do now is make it editable. To do that, I just click here. You see that's now greyed out, the icon's changed, and the object tab's gone. But I can now use these options here. If you don't know this already, I just select the point mode for example, live selection, and click and drag over these points and then move them, rotate them, etc. I'll just undo that. I can also use axis modification, and we'll come back to that shortly. For now I'll turn it off, go back to the model mode, turns off point mode, you'll note, and let's see what's changed with the scale tool. So now that it's a polygon object, I can click and drag to change its size using the axes here, much as we did when it's a parametric object, but using the axes rather than those little orange squares that have now disappeared. If I select it, go to the coordinates, you see the scale hasn't changed, which is good because it means that if we give it some children they won't get skewed axes. And it's the size down here, as you can see, that's changing in X there, for example. So let's give it a child now. I'll use a cone again. Switch to the move tool, move it up so we can see it, and make it a child of the cube. So I select the cube, back to the scale tool, and at the moment it's scaling in all directions, the cone that is, but that's because it's a parametric object. Let's make that editable too. Now if I select the cube and I scale it in X, you can see the cone scaling in the same way. And importantly, if I select the cone, the rotate tool, rotate it around, it remains stable. If we wanted to adjust the parent, make it longer this way perhaps, without affecting the cone, we'd have to temporarily take the cone out of the hierarchy, change the size of the cube, then put the cone back. I don't need the cone anymore. I'll just select that, use the delete key to remove it, and let's have a look at this cube. At the moment, when I change its size in Y, it moves from the center. It actually moves from the center of the axis, which brings us back to axis modification. If I just enable that, go for the move tool, click and drag the axis over, you'll see that it moves independently. And if I now go for the rotate tool, you can see that it rotates from that point. Well, you would do, just undo that. I need to turn axis modification off first, and now you can see that it rotates from its new axes. So this is very useful when it comes to the scale tool, because what I can do is position the axis at the bottom of the cube so it scales from that point. Let's go back to the move tool, enable axis modification, and with it enabled, what you can do is just hover over the cube. As the edges, polygons or points light up, if you click there, the axis will jump to that point, it will snap to that point. So I want it to snap to this polygon at the bottom, so I'll just move over it. When it highlights, just click there, and there's the axis right at the bottom. So now turn off axis modification, back to the scale tool. Now I can scale it from the bottom. So this is rotated oddly. What I'll do is just delete this now and create another one, and we'll move on to animation. And once again, with animation, you'll find that the scale tool works rather differently to the move tool or the rotate tool. I'll just make this cube editable first. It's selected, so I'll just click here to do that. And I want to look at the move tool first, so I'll select that. The time slider is at frame 0. I can click and drag on it to put it there if it's not. I can also just click anywhere along here to position it, and of course I can take it back to 0 by clicking here. So it's at frame 0. Currently we have position, scale and rotation enabled. All I need to do is click here to create a keyframe. You can see it just there. And I'll move the time slider along. Let's go to frame 30. Move the cube, record again. Now if I scrub along the timeline, click in and drag in the time slider, you can see we have an animation. It's always important when you're creating an animation to move the time slider first. I just want to show you that if I were to move the cube first, then the time slider, the cube would just snap back to its previously recorded keyframe. So always move the slider first, then the object, then hit record. Okay, so that's worked well for the position. Let's see what happens when we switch to the scale tool. If you use rotation, you'll see it works perfectly the same way as the move tool. So now I'm in the scale tool, model mode. I'll change the size, click and drag to the left, record a keyframe, move the time slider along, change the size, record again, and you see that nothing's actually been recorded. The cube's just staying at the size that we last changed it to. The reason for this is that you can't actually record size. There is a workaround which we'll come to shortly, but for now we're restricted to move, scale and rotate. So the way to record a change in scale is to switch to the object mode. And now I change the scale and record. You see the change in scale. So this is the technique to use for animation, as long as you don't have a child to the object that you want to scale that you subsequently want to rotate, because then you're going to get the problem we saw earlier with the skewed axes. But as long as you've just got a single object or an object with children that aren't going to be rotated, this is the way to do it using the object mode. So I'll just delete that now, and I want to show you how you could record the change in size. So back with the cube, switch back to model mode, make it editable, and the way that you can record a change in size is to use PLA. That's this option here, point level animation. So I'll enable that by clicking on it, record a keyframe, move along the timeline, change the size and record. And now you can see that I have a recording of the animation. What you're actually recording here is the position of the points. If I just go for point mode, live selection, select a couple of points at the top there, move them up and record, you see that that's recorded too. Okay, so if you've got a hierarchy, you've got children that you want to subsequently rotate, this is the technique to use. The downside of it is, with point level animation, is you don't have quite so much control if you want to take the animation further. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's to do with F-curves. With object mode and the scale tool, changing the scale, you get full access to F-curves, but if you're using PLA, it's somewhat limited. So if you can do it safely, it's always a better option to use object mode in conjunction with the scale tool for animations of this kind. So back with the bot again, and I want to show you how I'd set the eyes up for animation. At the moment they're both selected. If you look, you see the axis is at the center there, and that's because I've moved the axis for each down to the bottom. But I prefer it if I just had one object to animate rather than two. So what I'm going to do is click and drag a mark to select them both, right click and go for group objects just here. This gives me a new null parent with the two eyes inside it, and you'll note that its axis is at the center of the axes of its children. Whenever you use this method to group objects, you always get a parent whose axis is at the center of the combined centers of the children. So in this case it works really well. I can just click and drag here to animate the eyes from the bottom. But I want to show you what would happen if I move the null. So I'll go for axis modification, switch to the move tool, and I'm going to move the null up to the top of the eyes, turn axis modification off, back to the scale tool, model mode, and now when I click and drag there, I change the size from the top. So this is something to bear in mind with hierarchies. The children will always move, scale or rotate from the position of their parent, even though their axes may not be at their centres. Doesn't make any difference. They'll just scale, in this case, from the position of the parent. So let's just take that back to where it was. Prefer it at the bottom. Now I want to look at recording an animation. So the null's selected. If I were to use model mode, it just wouldn't work, even using PLA, because the null has no points. So what I need to do is switch to object mode, and object mode really comes into its own here now, because with object mode selected and the scale tool, I can just click to record a position, move along the timeline, change the scale of the eyes there, record again, and I have my animation. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. You should have a good idea now of how to use the scale tool when you're working with hierarchies and animation. If you have enjoyed the tutorial and you'd like to see some more, you'll find a complete course at 3dverve.com. Time to learn Cinema 4D R13. As well as animation, the course covers materials, modelling, lighting and rendering, and setting up cameras. These are some of the renders from the course. Check it out, www.3dverve.com.